Welcome to today's Wayne Moore Center event featuring Senator Jeff Merkley. I'm Dan Tishner, Director of the Center's Program for Democratic Governance and Knight Chair of Political Science. During today's event, we will welcome your questions. There's a Q&A button on your screen where you can submit questions, which will not be visible to the entire audience, and which our center staff will collect. And we'll try to get in as many questions as we can today. And just to give you a sense of the format, we're going to start with roughly about 25 minutes of comments from Senator Merkley, followed by Q&A. I'd also like to underscore before we get started that the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics relies significantly on your donations to run its programs that serve students in the larger community and to host events like this one. If you could take time to click the link in the chat box to make a donation of any amount, it would be much appreciated. You can also visit our website at waynemoorecenter.uoregon.edu. For today's event, I have the privilege of welcoming Senator Jeff Merkley. Senator Merkley, welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Senator Merkley has represented Oregon in the U.S. Senate since 2009. Born in Myrtle Creek and the son of a union machinist, he is a first-generation college graduate. Prior to serving in the Oregon House of Representatives, he worked at the Office of the Secretary of Defense on the security of American military technology, as well as in the Congressional Budget Office, where he analyzed nuclear weapons policies and programs. Senator Merkley is a member of many Senate committees, as I think most of our audience knows, including the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Budget Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. There's so much more to say, but I'm sure we would all love to dig in. Today, Senator Merkley will be focusing on the fight for democracy, both at home and abroad. Senator Merkley, we're so pleased you could join us today. And so on behalf of the Wayne Moore Center, the University of Oregon, and our audience, a warm welcome. And Senator, the floor, I guess I should say the Zoom space here is yours.
Dan, thank you very much for your introduction. And Wayne Morse, one-of-a-kind senator, loved to give speeches on the floor, famous for really analyzing issues every which way. He cared deeply about labor and civil rights and public education. The biography that I think I read about 30 years ago, A Tiger in the Senate, full of stories as he fought to make America and the world a better place. The center keeps his memory and mission alive. Thank you for being an active and leading voice on the issues, particularly involving the issue of government of, by, and for the people. Our Constitution creates these institutions, the judiciary, the executive, the legislative branches, and it's clear that every generation has to work at the process of making these institutions work better. And I will come to that a little bit later in my speech, but I certainly think that this is a moment where we need a lot of repair work. So the world as a whole is engaged in this struggle between democracy and autocracy. I got my first experience at the difference when I was an exchange student when I was 16 years old in a village in Ghana in West Africa. And Ghana was ruled by General Achampong. And about every so many years, every 3 or 4 years, there'd be another military coup and there'd be more edicts. And I saw a lot of signs around Ghana that said whatever. And then it would say, do this, and it would say, by order. And I'd say, by order of whom? And the answer was always, well, by order of the most recent dictator of our country, the most recent autocrat. It'll probably be somebody new soon, but by order. Quite different than by law, if you will. And Ghana actually went through a process after multiple dictators where they had a dictator Flight Lieutenant Rawlings, who decided to help the country transition to a democratic system of government by and for the people. And they have had many years and have moved in and out of the strength of that. But the point is that countries choose, people choose, and we had in the 20th century a real growth in representative democracy. By some some measures, half the world's population was under some form of democratic government. They vary in how strong, if you will. But over the last 20 years, so many elected leaders have worked to transition to being lifetime rulers. I was over on a trip to Africa where we were meeting with the president of Rwanda. And he had been very vocal in saying to other leaders around Africa, keep your constitution, keep your restrictions on how many times you can run for re-election. But he was running out of his second term, and then his tune changed. And we were trying to keep him on the path of, you can be the one that can establish a tradition in Rwanda of peaceful transition of power, that the institutions are greater than if you will, the impulse to be in power forever. Like you're doing more good for the country by establishing that rhythm. And in the end, he couldn't do it. In the end, he basically, through various means, ignored or rewrote the Constitution. And we see that all over the world. The last 2 decades have not been good in this consideration. And so now Freedom House says about 1/5 of the world has democratic representation. So we're in that struggle between that vision of power comes from above, it's implemented through authoritarian control, and power comes from the people, and it's implemented from below by the ballot box. So the ballot box is really that pulsating heart of a democracy. Which brings us to Russia and Ukraine and current events, because there's no better example of the rise of authoritarianism than Putin's illegal, basically warping of the institutions that have been set up under Yeltsin. So just steadily, gradually, he has converted Russia into an autocracy. And now he wants to take over Ukraine, and he has 2 really driving impulses on this. One is his sense that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest injustice, and it is upon him to be the great leader who restores greater Russia. And what better place to restore greater Russia than creating a broad swath of Russia going to the Black Sea in the south. In addition, he hates the idea of freedom on his southern border. So here's the Ukrainians, close cousins of the Russians, who have repeatedly said, we are willing to fight to maintain democratic institutions. Let's go back to 2004, the Orange Revolution. The 2004 presidential election runoff was marred by massive corruption, voter intimidation, electoral fraud, and the nationwide protests led to the annulment of that corrupt election and a second runoff that world monitoring bodies say was run fairly. So they saved their republic. And then you have 10 years later, you have a leader, President Yanukovych, who decided he was going to yield to Russian pressure and put Ukraine under Putin's thumb. And the protest became known as the Maidan Revolution. Maidan in this case being the word for square. And I'll mispronounce it. It was something like Maidan Nezolnosti or something of that nature. Anyway, but Maidan, so Independence Square. So it became the symbol that they were committed to the vision of government by the people, and protests erupted across the country. And President Yanukovych fled the country and they saved their republic again. And how did Russia respond? Well, Russia proceeded to, send their little green men into the eastern, as they came to be called, little green men, because Russia didn't admit that they were Russians, and they were wearing green uniforms with no markings on them. Sent them in to essentially control the eastern portion of Ukraine known as the Donbass, and to support breakaway states of Donetsk and Luhansk, and to annex the Crimea Peninsula. So that was his immediate response. But what he did in 2014 has not been recognized by the world. It's not permanent. It's not kind of a solidification of the greater Russia. It hasn't wiped out the Ukrainian determination to preserve a democracy. So how irritating it is to have that freedom-loving nation on his southern border, where people are determined to preserve freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, freedom to protest, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, as a contrast to his absolute tightening of authoritarian control. Well, that brings us to just over a month ago, Putin launching this horrific attack. You have President Zelensky pleading with the world for help. You have NATO coming together and delivering massive amounts of help. You have the US Congress passed a $13.5 billion emergency package for military aid and humanitarian aid. You have Europe rethinking its dependence on Russian gas and oil. You have historic sanctions against Russia and against the oligarchs. You have Finland thinking about joining NATO, and Switzerland by kind of modifying its neutrality to provide military equipment to Ukraine. You have a massive response of Western democracies saying we're going to stand with Ukrainian people. President Biden is right to call the assault on civilian targets a war crime. It's been a war crime since the middle of the last century, following World War II, to deliberately attack civilian targets. And yet there's Putin shelling apartment buildings, schools, healthcare clinics, and humanitarian corridors that have been agreed to let people escape safely. And so just these last 2 days, we've had the horrific images of a different form of war crimes, not the shelling, but the shooting of Ukrainian civilians, leaving bodies throughout the streets as the Russian soldiers retreat. Just horrific images, executions in the street, people with their hands tied behind their back, mass graves. So I stand completely with President Biden in calling this a war crime, calling Putin a war criminal. And that will have to be pursued over time. But let's realize that as we're fighting for the Ukrainian people, we also have to fight for our American democracy. Our democracy is under assault. And let me paint a little bit of a picture here. You've got gerrymandering, in which politicians choose their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians. That certainly is an assault on equal representation. And our nation has always acknowledged that each one of us has a stake in the fairness of the elections, not just where we vote, but in the country as a whole. And that's why our Constitution lays out that, yes, states can make rules for elections, but the federal government can make rules that apply to the states to make sure elections are fair. And both are right there in the Constitution. So in addition to gerrymandering, we have dark money. The Supreme Court has given a green light to groups spending hundreds of millions of dollars in campaigns, independent campaigns with no disclosure. Now, if you or I make a donation to a campaign, if it's over $200, they have to report that donation, and we're aware they report it. And everybody who makes larger donations gets called by every candidate because they go, well, I can see you donated to so-and-so. I want to ask you for help in my race as well. But what applies to us normal people doesn't apply to the mega wealthy. They can run unlimited sums in independent campaigns, and they don't have to do any disclosure. Now, we had a Disclose Act to change this, but the Senate needed 60 votes to close debate. And we had 59 votes the first time we tried, and we had 59 votes the second time we tried to close debate. We couldn't get, unfortunately, a single person across the aisle. I hate to make this partisan, but Democrats stood on one side for transparency, and Republicans stood unanimously against transparency, which is very interesting because the story under McCain-Feingold, so you had John McCain and you had Russ Feingold a conservative military hawk, a progressive liberal who was very much against the war in Afghanistan. And they teamed up to say our elections should not be corrupted by large sums of money. Well, fast forward under that effort to pass McCain-Feingold, many members of the Senate gave speeches, and they said, we don't support these McCain-Feingold limits, but we support disclosure. Disclosure is the sunshine that sanitizes or purifies the system. But when we came to actually doing disclosure, the argument changed. And the argument was, no, we don't like disclosure after all. We don't like limits. We don't like disclosures. We think that freedom of speech means that people can, and large organizations can anonymously put hundreds of millions of dollars into campaigns and not be known, even though we, the ordinary American donating $200, has to be disclosed. What is that all about? That is about power. Now, let me put it this way. Right today at noon, there was an art display put up on the mall, and it's barrels of oil stacked into a wall, 3 barrels high. And it says on these barrels, it says that oil company profits in 2021 were $209 billion. Profits, not revenue, but profits. So if the fossil fuel industry, the oil industry, takes 1% of their money, net revenue, and puts it into politics, that would be $2 billion put into elections around the countries anonymously. And what do they do with that money? They do attack ads, and they create names out of thin air that sound very positive. Names like a better democracy. I'm just making up these names, like things like a better democracy, a better tomorrow, equal opportunity for all. Anything that sounds great. Throw in the word freedom, independence, the good future. You get the idea. And then they spend the money in huge amounts of attack ads. One study found that 70% of those attack ads include outright lies. So it doesn't matter. They don't have to tell the truth. In politics, and unfortunately, that's the case. You don't have to tell the truth when you do political ads. And this really contaminates our system. And it's a form of an exercise of power that complements other forms that the wealthiest in our country have to exercise power. So think about it this way. In this world where massive wealth is concentrated among just a few percent at the top, those individuals and those companies, they can have teams of lawyers that work every day, 365 days a year, working nights to get what they want. So they have this intense lawyerly system of filing suits, defending lawsuits, working every angle of the law. Then they have the lobbyists. The pharmaceutical industry has 2 lobbyists on Capitol Hill for every member of Congress. So if there are 535 of us between the House and the Senate, there's over 1,000 drug company lobbyists, just drug company lobbyists. So they have the lobby. They have media campaigns. A few $1 million, you can change how people think about an issue by running a media campaign. They have regular campaign donations, which they can give through PACs. And then they have dark money independent campaigns to brutalize, savage the reputations of those who they do not want in office, because those people maybe they think we should make a transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. Maybe they think that we should join the rest of the developed world and negotiate with drug companies for the price of our drugs so that we don't get ripped off here in America. Well, you get the idea. Very, very powerful groups that have all these tools. But what they haven't had the ballot box. And now they're coming after the ballot box here in America. 19 states passed laws in 2021 making it harder for targeted groups of Americans to vote. They're targeted at Black Americans, Latino Americans, tribal members, poor Americans, and college students. Now, what really irritates these folks is the idea of equal access to the ballot box. Because what they want to have all voting be done on election day, because election day is subject to many shenanigans. So let me explain the tools that are used routinely on election day. Well, first, you create very large precincts in places you don't want to vote, so the voting booths are very crowded. Second, you understaff those voting booths. Third, you change their location from year to year or election to election, so people are confused. Fourth, you put them in places where there is little parking. Fifth, you put out false information about the location or about the date of the election. You get the idea. It's very easy to create long lines in places where you don't want people to vote. And this isn't some fiction. Let's just take the last election in Georgia. Precincts that were 80% or more Black Georgians had a wait time to vote on election day 10 times as long as precincts that were 80% white. So these are very real tactics exercised continuously and in my mind, corruptly trying to block the ballot box. It's more sophisticated than the strategies of the past. Things like, well, you can register to vote if you can guess the number of jelly beans in the jar, or you have to give an essay on a certain clause of the Constitution and then be told, no, that's not right, you can't register to vote, or a ring of horses where men got on horses and surrounded the ballot box and only parted to let through the whites through to the ballot box, but not the Black Americans. I mean, all those things, those were done in the past. This is more sophisticated than that. The antidote to these things is vote by mail, like we have in Oregon. The antidote is early voting, as many states have. The antidote is monitoring voter registration to make sure registration is fair and that the voting registration lists are not purged in advance of the election, which has been happening. So we have to recognize that we need to proceed to pass the For the People Act. For the People Act, Senate Bill number 1, my bill. It took on the issues of defending the ballot box, of gerrymandering, of dark money, of voter suppression. And then during the summer, because I had 49 sponsors, we sat in a room and rewrote it, gave it a new name, and it became Freedom to Vote to get Joe Manchin to join us. But here is the thing. In order to actually have a final debate and a final vote, you have to have a preliminary vote that closes debate. And in the Senate, that takes 60 votes. That rule, in place since 1975, means that the minority party, if the majority leader says, hey, 41 of us are not going to vote to close debate, they kill any chance to have a final debate and a final vote. So in our partisan tribal politics, that power for the minority to block a policy bill from ever getting a vote is a very tempting power, because you don't want the other side to succeed. If they succeed, voters might reelect them. So stop them from succeeding, stop them from fixing issues, and certainly stop them from defending the ballot box. And why is that? Well, if you poll people across the United States, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents all say defend the ballot box. But in the halls of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, has concluded that his team is favored by allowing dark money. His team is favored by allowing gerrymandering. That doesn't help in the Senate because we're statewide elected, but it helps get Republicans elected in the House. And that his team is favored by strategies to block the ballot box for Black Americans, Latino Americans, college students, tribal Americans, and poor Americans. To me, this is profoundly corrupt. And so that failure to get, if you will, 60 votes to close debate, that's what people call a filibuster. We shouldn't really call it a filibuster. It has nothing to do with speaking on the floor. It hasn't since 1975. But it's still called that. So let's compare what happened this year to 1891. In 1891, there was a federal law. Henry Cabot Lodge was in the House, so it was called the Lodge Act. The House passed it, and it said, we are going to provide federal officials to any district that asks for them to defend the integrity of registration process, the voting process, and the counting of ballots. The three main stages in 1891, because the integrity of elections across the country is a supreme responsibility in our republic. That was the Lodge Act. So what happened in the US Senate? There was a filibuster, a group of Southern Democrats and Western Republicans, for different reasons, didn't want to spend time on that bill. The Southern Democrats didn't want this bill because they, unfortunately, were standing for the process of suppressing the right of Black Americans to vote in the South. The Western Republicans had something else on their mind. They didn't really care about what happened in the South, but they wanted to get to a different bill that involved utilizing more silver currency. So they were called silver Republicans, because that would help the silver mining, or the value of the silver mined in the West. So you had the Southern Democrats, the silver Republicans, they teamed up, they prevented closing debate, and that bill was killed by filibuster. So there you had it, a broad, pretty comprehensive voter integrity bill, 1891, defeated by filibuster. And what did you have here a couple months ago? You had a broad, powerful voting rights bill defeated by a filibuster. I worked all last year to reform the Senate so this would not happen. And there are three basic pathways the Senate could go. Pathway number one, keep the current system where the minority can veto the ability to have a final debate and a final vote on a bill, which encourages partisanship and encourages paralysis, and means we can't address issues that should be addressed. Well, doorway number three, or path number three, is get rid of the filibuster completely, in which the majority can simply roll over the top of the minority. The minority has really no way to delay things, no leverage, if you will. That's the way the House of Representatives works, turns the Senate into the House. So that was door one and door three. I was arguing for door number two. Door number two was to replace the secret silent filibuster by restoring the talking public filibuster. I first put this as a rule change back in 2011. 40 plus senators said, yeah, let's do that. But we didn't have the number to change the rules, needed more. And this last year, I said, let's do this as a rule interpretation. That only takes 50 votes instead of 67, because you need 2/3 actually to change a rule under the Senate rules. And a rule interpretation is what Mitch McConnell did when he was in the majority, to say that the Supreme Court debate could be closed by simple majority. And he also did a rule interpretation to enable them to cut taxes by simple majority, because that was the top priority. So his top two priorities are already simple majority. That's Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader. His top two priorities are simple majority. But to defend the ballot box, the central responsibility of the oath of office we take to the Constitution, that takes a supermajority of 60. And no Republican would join us, because they were told this is the red line. You do not allow this bill to ever be debated. And so we needed 50 Democrats and a vice president to say, yes, we can. Yes, there can. The Senate will debate. They will have a vote. If we can cut taxes by simple majority, we can debate and protect our elections by simple majority. In fact, our founders said, this is our vision. Never allow a supermajority requirement on legislation. Hamilton said it will be tedious delays and contemptible compromises as a result. Madison said, you will undermine the very premise of a republic, which is the majority makes the decision, not the minority. And yet, the Senate has done exactly what the founders said don't do. Why did the founders speak to this so powerfully? They were writing the Constitution while they were under the Confederation Congress. The Confederation Congress required a supermajority to get things done, and so they were paralyzed. So they were living the paralysis and saying the minority's making the decisions. That's not right in a democracy. The majority should decide. Well, we've ignored their advice. We ignored the construction of the Constitution. And so I pushed for us to have these 50 votes to reinterpret the rule that would allow us to debate this election bill by simple majority, close debate, or have a debate on the final passage of the bill and a vote. And it came down to it, and we had 2 members of the Senate. And one of those is Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and one is Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. And they said, we want to defend the filibuster because we want to defend the process of due consideration in the Senate. We want to increase and encourage compromise. And I said, if you want to encourage compromise, then let's get rid of the secret silent filibuster, which encourages paralysis, and do the talking filibuster. The talking filibuster encourages compromise in the following fashion. Those who take the floor to delay things for leverage have to actually be on the floor. So it becomes a public exercise. Everyone can see the stand you're taking. You're taking courage of your convictions to take your stand. And it's hard because you have to keep that conversation going night and day. So because of that hard work, you have a reason to seek a compromise. You're not sure how long you can sustain it. And ultimately, Rule 19 of the Senate says you can only speak twice to an issue. So ultimately, after many, many weeks, longer than any debate in Senate history, you could run out of speeches. Take a very long time together. Never happened in Senate history. Never happened. But it could happen. And the fact that it could happen means you have an incentive to compromise. Meanwhile, the majority cannot afford for a bill to take up the floor for weeks at a time. Just like the silver Republicans were seeking to move to a bill that would benefit the price of silver, everyone's seeking to move to another bill. There's other things to do. There's other nominations to undertake. The majority has an incentive to negotiate as well. They also have to make their case publicly on the floor of the Senate. So I'm sorry to report, in the end, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema voted against an incentive to compromise, against an incentive to work out a deal, and voted for partisanship and paralysis by sustaining the secret silent filibuster. So here we are, working to restore our own democracy while we are also fighting to support through massive weapons transfers, through humanitarian aid, through bringing NATO together, to bringing the European Union together, to support the Ukrainians in their vision of government of by and for the people. We're trying to hold up the light to the world to say, this is what humanity should be about. People living in freedom, every person empowered to have a role in the direction, the governance of their nation. But to be powerful in that debate, we have to fix with our own house. We have to get our own house in order. You know, I'm thankful that we're not disintegrating into the vision that I experienced in Africa as a 16-year-old. Certainly we're far from that, but have no doubt, our institutions are in disrepair, and we need to come together, pass the For the People Act, or its reincarnation as Freedom to Vote Act, and continuously work to defend the right of every American to participate fairly in our democratic republic. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, for covering so much rich ground on a variety of democratic challenges and ways to address and maybe begin to solve them. We're now going to turn to questions, and to get us started, I would like to introduce 2 outstanding University of Oregon undergraduates who are also Wayne Morse scholars. And if you guys could turn on your screens, this is Matthew and Luda. Luda Issaharov is a global studies Russian and political science major. And Matthew Hampton is a 3 p.m. and political science major. I had a hard enough time when I was an undergrad getting through one major. So you guys just are so impressive. Luda and Matthew, welcome. We're delighted you're here. And Luda, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Senator Merkley, for being here today. My question is about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I have current family ties and I trace my roots back to there. As we've all seen, thousands of innocent civilians as well as military troops are dead as a result of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And the conflict has been nothing short of a mass atrocity as hospitals and schools have been bombed and civilians aren't even safe getting groceries and supplies for survival. Saying that the United States has the best funded and strongest military in the world, my question is, how long will the United States continue to choose to stand by and not get involved as mass atrocities and genocides in Ukraine and beyond continue to take place?
It is absolutely horrific what Russia is doing in targeting civilians. And a concrete form of what Zelensky asked for was for a no-fly zone. And Biden said no to that. And I'll give you my perspective on it. And that perspective comes from my background was working on economic development in very poor countries. So I was in Ghana, I was in villages in Mexico for a couple summers, I was in India. I got my master's in economic development. I was at the World Bank, planning to go back to Africa. When I was given the chance to work on the issue of stabilizing nuclear tensions, the risk of nuclear war between then Soviet Union and the United States. And when I was offered that opportunity, I took it, which was a complete reversal of everything I was doing, because I said, you know what? The biggest threat to humanity is nuclear war. And at that time, the doomsday clock was a few minutes to midnight, and it's a clock kept by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists to estimate the risk of actual nuclear war. We'd had some very, very close calls. We'd had a training tape that was inserted that by accident that led our military to believe that Soviet Union was sending missiles our way. Came very close to responding. The Soviets or Russians had some confusion that came from, I think, aurora borealis, certain weather conditions that made them think we were attacking them. And a Russian in the chain of command stopped the orders to use nuclear weapons. We'd had some very, very close calls. What came out of that conversation was we can never allow American troops and Russian troops to enter into direct conflict, because if they do, each side will respond, it will accelerate, each side is nuclear armed, and we have a high risk of a nuclear world's nuclear war. And nuclear weapons, one weapon can wipe out, a very small weapon can wipe out an entire city like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. When people talk about a tactical nuclear weapon, they're not talking about something much smaller than the kilotonnage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Biden, being well familiar with this from his background in foreign affairs, said we can do a lot to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, but it is going to be their determination and their soldiers on the battlefield. And so, therefore, we are not going to deploy troops across the line. I think that was the right decision. And then on the no-fly zone, people have some impression that, we just kind of put planes up and the Russians stop flying. It doesn't work like that. The no-fly zone in Iraq, we bombed every air battery. We took out all the airfields, and you'd have to do that across the border into Russia. It'd be American planes bombing Russia. It's almost few people can imagine this doesn't end up with a threat of Russia saying, you continue, we go to at least upgrade to tactical nuclear weapons. We will completely obliterate Ukraine. They might not launch them at the US because they launch them at the US, we destroy Russia. Everybody's destroyed, but destroy Ukraine. So I think Biden made the right call. And what we learned from Afghanistan, what the Russians learned and we learned, that the balance of power is tilted towards defendants against the offense. If you have anti-tank missiles, which cost very little versus a tank, if you have Stinger missiles or anti-aircraft missiles versus an airplane, and those missiles cost very little compared to the airplane. If you have improvised explosive devices that can be made and put everywhere to basically blow up resupply convoys, you can make it almost impossible to occupy a country. Russia could attempt to do what, and they are on the path of doing what they did in Chechnya, which was essentially they spent 7 years bombing it to rubble. But in this case, the Ukrainian patriots have so much more ability than Chechnya had. Chechnya didn't have Stingers. They didn't have javelins. They didn't have 24 countries providing them with military arms. And by the way, Russians do not control the sky in Ukraine. The Ukrainians still have a significant MiG Air Force that has not been destroyed. And they are using it sparingly for reasons we're not completely sure of. And I've had some various classified briefings, so I can't go into details. But they do have the ability, and it has really dampened Russian use of their planes. Anyway, that's just a summary to say, I think we're doing the right line. Engaging in a manner that might lead to the nuclear destruction of Ukraine would be a horrific, obviously horrific outcome.
Matthew, please go ahead and raise your question for Senator Merkley.
Yes, thank you, Dan, for the opportunity to ask a question. And thank you, Senator, for being here and for your words today. I work at the LGBT Student Resource Center on campus. And every time I'm in there, when I talk to community members and students that we serve, I hear stories about discrimination that they face on a daily basis. And I know that when you were Speaker of the House in Oregon, you worked really closely with Basic Rights Oregon to spearhead the successful passage of Oregon's Domestic Partnership Bill and the Oregon Equality Act, which bans discrimination against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity in employment, housing, access to public accommodations, as you know. I wanted to ask, how does your experience in Oregon compare with your current work to pass the Federal Equality Act? And what do you think ultimately needs to be done to turn this and other LGBT plus legislation like gay and trans panic defense prohibition into federal law?
So in that year of 2007, I had said publicly that if the Democrats took the Oregon House, we were going to pass both those bills. The Oregon Senate said, we don't want to take on both bills at once. That might be too much. And I said, well, the House is going to pass them. The Oregon House is going to pass it. So, well, if the House was going to pass them, the Oregon Senate wasn't going to leave one sitting. And so we did get both of those passed. I had worked very hard during the previous session when I was in the minority to build a coalition that could pull the bill from committee and get it done in the Oregon House. And Karen Minnis, who was the speaker, each time we pulled a bill, she got it referred back to committee, or then she started, we'd introduce a new bill into committee to pull it to the floor. And so then she started gut and stuffing it, which means amend everything that's in it out of it and then move it to a new committee. So if you pulled it to the floor, you wouldn't be voting on what the original contents of the bill were. Anyway, so this was when I was in the minority. When I became in the majority, I'm like, we are passing these two bills. So I come to the US Senate, and in 1998, the Senate had debated the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or ENDA. And at that time, it failed by one vote. Now, please note here something very important, which is there was no filibuster. It failed by one vote, 50-49. No one said it has to get 60 votes to close debate. That tells you how much the Senate has changed since 1998 until now, over the last 2.5 decades. The potential was there, somebody could have, but it was not yet, the Senate code was not yet broken. The Senate code, by this I mean, when the Senate was founded, those 26 senators looked around at each other and they said, you know, we can listen to everyone before we vote. And they did. So when they rewrote the rules in 1805, they said, we have the Senate code. We have no need to have a motion to move the prior question. And so they took it out of the rule book. Aaron Burr was in charge of rewriting the rule book. They took it out of the rule book. And so the Senate now had the Senate code alone, the culture of saying we listen to everyone and vote. And it wasn't until the mid 1800s that people really started to abuse this by giving long speeches at the end of a session. And when they started to do that, the newspapers said, that breaks the Senate code. They didn't call it the code. That's the name I'm giving it to kind of stress kind of what a strong culture it was, strong understanding. They said they're stretching the Senate code. That's piracy. That's where the word filibuster comes from. It means freebooter. It means the pirates have taken over the Senate. They're breaking the Senate code. They're stopping the gears of democracy, of debate and voting from happening. In 1998, lost by 1 vote because Senator Pryor was visiting his son, Mark Pryor, who had bone cancer in hospital. Senator Mark Pryor's son became the future Senator Mark Pryor that I served with. So why they didn't do reconsideration, we don't know. But here's 2009. Senator Kennedy has never gotten ENDA passed in all those years since 1998. And he's sick with brain cancer. And he says to, or actually because he was so sick, it was done through his team. His team says, Senator Kennedy wants you, Senator Merkley, to be the lead in taking on this major civil rights bill because you led the fight successfully in Oregon. And I can tell you, it was a stunning moment for me to have a civil rights icon like Ted Kennedy ask me to lead this battle. And lead it I did. And I worked day in and day out. And we finally got it to the floor in 2013, so 4 years later, and we passed it. We got the 60+ votes to close debate. I think we finally passed it with like 64 votes. And the Republican House refused to bring it up for debate, so it never became law. So I got together with the stakeholders and we were debating like, what was our next move? Should we do a jury duty bill? Should we do just public accommodations? Should we undertake to address financial transactions? Or should we do the Equality Act? In other words, all of it. And we decided it was time to do all of it. If people were going to vote for ending discrimination in employment, we ought to be able to get them to end discrimination in jury duty. We ought to be able to get them to support ending discrimination in accommodations and financial transactions. So that's the Equality Act. So I became the author of the Equality Act, and we have been working to get it passed ever since, and not yet successfully. But my two kind of co-pilots on this, one is Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, who is the first senator, openly lesbian senator to serve in the US Senate. And one is Cory Booker, who comes from a civil rights family history, fighting discrimination, very eloquent speaker. So, there is a picture of me kicking off the first presentation of the Equality Act. And standing next to me is John Lewis. And we were in the Johnson room. The Johnson room is where he had his offices, and the windows look out on the Supreme Court. So I'm looking over the bank of cameras, seeing the Supreme Court. I've got Tammy, I've got Cory, I've got John Lewis, and I'm thinking, how did the son of a machinist from Oregon end up leading this civil rights battle next to somebody like John Lewis? But Matthew, I'd like to tell you we've got it done. Unfortunately, it is proving much, much harder. The lines have solidified in a way that's making it very hard to get those 60 votes to close debate that we are going to need to pass this bill.
Thank you both, Matthew and Luda. So we have a bunch of questions in the chat box, but I also know our time is very short. So let me just, I think we have 1 minute left. So let me try to
Standing next to me
summarize.
is Carly, who's about to hit the kill switch on me.
Okay. So let me just summarize a bunch of them, which are asking you what your thoughts are about the current nomination process with Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, and then also on the Supreme Court and reform and so forth. So if you have a 30-second version you'd like to offer on that.
On the nomination process, it's
Yeah.
absolutely horrific. The initial Congress, Senate dealt with 4 cabinet positions. We're now dealing with some 2,000 positions, and it doesn't fit the time, and you have to go through a really complicated process. I've laid out a much simplified process that allows us to have a debate time over a group of nominees, then go to those nominees and vote up or down one after the other. And we need to do something like that because it's absolutely an instrument that the minority of both sides have used to eat up all the clock and do so the Senate cannot function on policy. On the Supreme Court, I engaged in a filibuster on the Supreme Court. It was a 15.5-hour speech saying, do not proceed to complete the theft of a Supreme Court seat. Any nominee from any president had always been debated and voted on in the history until Mitch McConnell decided there would be no debate and no vote on Merrick Garland. And that theft then kind of took the polarization of the court to a new level. It damaged deeply the legitimacy. And my point to the majority leader and the minority was, don't do it because there's no way to fix it down the line. The court becomes irrevocably damaged. What happens? The Democrats come back and steal a seat from a Republican president? That won't add to the legitimacy of the court. Well, we add seats to the Senate, that won't add to the legitimacy of the court. There's no way to fix it. Don't do it. I never imagined I could speak for 15.5 hours, but I did it because it was such a big deal for an attack on a core institution. Third topic, the nomination of our Judge Brown Jackson. She's incredibly qualified. She engaged in what I would call gracious dignity, discipline. She just took all the horrific stuff and just kind of let it pass her. I think won the hearts of a number of my colleagues, 3 of whom are willing to vote for across the aisle, which is great. She'll be passed in a bipartisan fashion. I am really pleased that nobody got on the Democratic side got injured and or killed in this last week, because she'd probably never become a Supreme Court justice. If in that case, because the pressure on the Republicans to delay and vote against her would be so tremendous. But it looks like we're going to get there. And I think it's a very valuable thing to have somebody who has been on the side of the law, ensuring the defendant's rights are honored, that it's a fair process for the defendant. The criminal justice system demands that there is good representation for the accused to make it a fair trial. And to be attacked for being a lawyer for the accused is to completely fail to understand that it's as important to have a capable defender as a capable prosecutor. So she brings that. She brings diversity of life experience. She brings diversity in terms of race. I think she's an incredible contribution to the court. Thank you all so very much for inviting me to join you today.